With regard to sexuality, you said that it is a good question to ask yourself. Who is in control? Well, yeah, that's the question, isn't it? You know, if you're masturbating to pornography and the consequence of that is an immediate influx of guilt, then you have to ask yourself who's in control. And that's a really important question, who's in control. That's what terrified me about developing some psychoanalytic acumen, because once you realize that you're a house that many spirits can and do inhabit, and that many of them aren't you, and that many of them aren't working towards the purposes you might want yourself to be working to, and that's the realization of the myth that you're embodying from the Jungian perspective. It's a very, very serious question. The fundamental human myth is Cain versus Abel. And so who are you? Are you Cain or Abel? Well, the answer is you're both. And then the question is, well, who's got the upper hand? And then the next question is, who do you want to have the upper hand? Is it God and Abel or Satan and Cain? And that's a question that's just as germane to non-believers as it is to believers. And isn't that remarkable and appalling and overwhelming and terrifying all at the same time, if you have any sense of what it means? So, if your behavior is embarrassing you, well, there's only two possibilities, isn't there? You shouldn't be so embarrassed. And I suppose the voice that says yes to all expression of human sexuality would say that your guilt and shame is merely the detrimental hangover of an oppressive patriarchy that's judgmental in its attitudes towards sexuality. Well, yeah, well, what would you use judgment to differentiate if it isn't sexuality? So I don't think that argument goes anywhere. You have to consult your own conscience. Like, I know the conscience can become an oppressive force on its own. That's the indwelling of the great tyrant, you know, and Freud made much of that, a too oppressive superego. And I've certainly seen clients whose expression of healthy sexuality was inhibited by a too rigid superego. That can definitely happen. But that doesn't mean that all guilt about all forms of sexual expression constitutes a superego run amok. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that there was some relationship between the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which, according to Randy Thornhill, by the way, who's perhaps the world's top biological thinker on this particular topic, Thornhill believed that the liberalism of the 60s was a consequence, at least in part, and in large part, I should say, of the hygienic revolution of the previous 6 decades and more that enabled us to reduce the impact, at least in the West, of infectious diseases. And because we were much less prone to the transmission and receipt of infectious diseases, we could afford to be more liberal by the 1960s. So we got more sexually liberal. And what happened? AIDS. And I say that without prejudice. And what's the most effective means of facilitating the reproduction of a deadly virulent agent and its propagation through the population? Unrestrained sexual behavior. Sexual shame is there for a reason, and it's not a trivial reason, and it's not just going to go away because we may wave the magic wand and make the patriarchal oppressor vanish, and that's not going to happen either, by the way. So if you're ashamed about your sexual behavior, then you have to ask yourself, is the shame wrong or is the sexual behavior wrong? And I'm asking you, I'm not judging your behavior, because what the hell do I know about you? And I have enough trouble with my own behavior, so, you know, this is on you. Is your shame what you should be dispensing with, or the behavior? And, you know, it might be a little of column A and a little of column B, because life is never simple. But if you don't feel ennobled by your porn-related masturbation, then perhaps that means it's of questionable utility. I certainly don't see it as a stabilizing social force. I don't see it as something people do in public and brag about. And I know that sexual behavior is private and should remain that way, but you get what I'm driving at. So, look, I think people shouldn't lie, especially to themselves. And I think repeatedly engaging in a behavior that you judge yourself to be morally reprehensible is a form of performative contradiction, which is the acting out of a lie. And I suspect you know that, or you wouldn't be asking the question. And so, what should you do with pornography? Well, you know the answer to that, and so does everybody else. Everyone knows it's not good. It's not good for those who produce it. It's not good for those who participate, wittingly or unwittingly, because there's plenty of them, in its production. It's not good for its consumers, or certainly not the highest good. And what's the highest good? Sexuality incorporated within a functional, intimate relationship, bound by vows of mutual celibacy. And we all know that too. That stabilizes our families. It stabilizes our societies. It stabilizes our psyches. And so anything you do that isn't in service of that goal is likely to be counterproductive. And I suspect it's your own psyche, your own soul telling you that. So if your sexual behavior isn't an expression of your highest being, then it isn't serving you in the deepest sense. You're serving it. And that's what your shame indicates. So get out there and find a partner and commit to her or him. And do you have any advice on what to do with porn and masturbation? The less porn, the better. That's my advice. But let's make that more specific. To the degree that use of porn and masturbation is undermining your sense of yourself and providing you with a dearth of motivational reasons to get out there and engage with a real partner, then it's definitely not in your best interest, and that's what your conscience is telling you. And it's the expedient at the expense of the meaningful. Obviously, right? Obviously, there isn't any more obvious manifestation of the expedient at the expense of the meaningful than pornography and masturbation. And that's hardly a heroic path. So maybe the less of it, the better. I'm aware, by the way, of the statistics showing that the introduction of pornography into a community doesn't raise but lowers rape probability. I think that's a separate discussion from this, but I just want you to know I'm not ignorant of that. Who's in control? That's the issue. Is it you, or is it the sexuality that's in control? Have you integrated your sexual life into the rest of your life so that the whole thing makes a harmonious balance? And are you in charge, or is it in charge, so to speak? Because if you're not in charge with that harmonious balance, then things are going to waver wildly out of control, and you're going to find yourself in dreadful trouble. That happens whenever any given drive, or really any given value, predominates to the exclusion of all else. Now, it seems to me that sexuality is best handled within the confines of a relationship. That's the classic ethical solution to the problem. It's because sexuality brings with it a tremendous amount of responsibility. Now, people don't like to think that, especially people who I would say are low in conscientiousness, let's say, or high in impulsivity. It's easy for people to believe in, what would you call it, casual sex, which is not something that I think exists, because I don't think you can divorce sex from its sociological or political or economic or psychological consequences. There's no such thing as casual sex. I think the reason for that is that the consequences of sex are too dramatic. It's not just pregnancy and disease, let's say, which are both as dramatic as consequences can be in life, but also the fact that there's no disentangling sexual behavior from emotional behavior. Or maybe you could say even worse, if you try to disentangle your sexual behavior from your emotional behavior, then I think what happens is that you end up cold and cynical. I mean, if you're a serial, if you have a lot of one-night stands and a lot of casual partners, then first of all, there's not much discrimination between one partner and the other, and so in some sense you're in a loop and just repeating the same act over and over. But you can't, there's nothing deep about it. There's nothing that enables you to establish a relationship with another person. And I think that you corrupt your soul in that way, and that you hurt yourself across time, and of course you're going to hurt other people as well. So I'm not a big admirer of the casual sex idea. I think it's a demented adolescence fantasy, fundamentally. It just doesn't work out in the real world. Now, healthy self-restraint, well, with regards to sexuality, it's the same with everything else, is that there's the necessity to forego immediate gratification for the purpose of medium to long-term thriving, let's say. So if your sexuality is integrated in an ethic that encompasses the rest of your life, and if it serves that ethic, then I would say it's properly restrained. If it's unhealthily repressed, well, then you're angry and bitter and resentful and cursing the opposite sex, or perhaps the same sex if you happen to be gay, for failing to recognize your particular form of sexual, attractiveness. I think resentment and anger are a good indication that there's something wrong with the manner in which your sexuality is restrained.